My name is Brian Ross from ABC News, and over the past few years we've had a number of panels like this talking about the consequences of investigative journalism. Many gripping tales like the one David just told you. We've had people with Polks and Pulitzers and people sent to the poorhouse because of their reporting. Today, 4 journalists, 3 of whom became enemies of the state where they were reporting, a 4th who was dragged through a never-ending, frivolous, ultimately lawsuit, and a 5th person whose job it is to drag people through lawsuits if he regards them as poor journalists. We're going to start with Melissa Chan. Melissa worked for Al Jazeera in China, and for her efforts was kicked out of the country. Melissa.
I guess I should talk about my expulsion, which took place last year. There was never an official explanation given to me by the Chinese government for why they asked me to leave. And my departure was followed by a little bit of media coverage, including media coverage in China. And looking at the situation about a week out, I wanted to try to get a sense of where the Chinese government was coming from and started looking at what state media was saying. And maybe it was a bit naive at the time, and it's certainly, we're halfway through the symposium, and it's been a discussion on panels yesterday, particularly, which is the issue of blowback and the smear campaign. When you report something that someone or an organization or a government does not like, they don't actually go after the facts, they go after you and try to discredit you. Suggest that there's something morally wrong with you, and place suspicion so that everything that you did beforehand in the country is suddenly suspect. And I wanted to take this opportunity to quickly read something that state media newspaper, the Global Times, wrote about me about a week after I left. The Global Times is also a Communist Party-owned paper, and I quote, "According to foreign journalist sources here in Beijing, Melissa Chan holds an aggressive political stance. According to foreign reports, she has a tense relationship with the management authorities of foreign correspondents." It goes on to say, "It is common practice for some foreign journalists to just piece together materials based on their presuppositions when reporting on China. If a foreign reporter cannot stay in China, we can only assume that he or she has done something to cross the line." And while there's been no official explanation, and I wouldn't dare suggest that it's solely because of my reporting that I had to leave the country, I'm sure the reporting didn't help. And I wanted to just share one piece that I did that's close to my heart. Many of you here have seen how difficult it is to do investigative reporting because of smaller staff, smaller budget. In my case, I was a country beat reporter, sometimes the only sole correspondent for Al Jazeera English in China, so I had to feed the beast and deal with the demands of daily news. So in pursuing this story, it was never formally pitched to my editors. I had to find free time. Time when the newsroom thought I had just gotten off work was when we picked up the camera and tried to investigate black jails in Beijing. And what are black jails? Black jails are extra-legal detention centers. These people that are thrown into these black jails are not criminals, they are petitioners. And the petitioning system is something that has been going on in China for many years. It started in the Qing dynasty, where local ordinary citizens felt if they couldn't get their problem redressed at a local court, or perhaps the officials themselves at the local level are the problem, they've got a corruption complaint, they travel thousands of miles to Beijing to appeal to the center of power. And to this day, there is a petitioning office in Beijing. And what I found compelling about this human rights story is that there's a narrative that the Chinese government puts out, which is the political leadership is always trying to solve the problems, whether it's rule of law or corruption. We're not the problems. The problem is those local guys in some faraway province. But in Beijing, we're trying to solve the problem. And so with black jails, the fact that these things were a 30-minute drive from Tiananmen Square and happening in the backyard of these people, either they're totally ignorant of it, which is a problem in of itself, or the central government of China is complicit. So there's 2 clips here, one from 2009. That was my first time investigating this. The stand-up is a one-time deal. We didn't expect to see what we saw. And we revisited the story in 2012, in part to see whether the situation had changed, because in the interim, the government had acknowledged the existence of black jails and also said they deal with the problem, and you'll see that the problem has not been solved. And I should add that the second report I did the month before I left.
We got the address from a former prisoner held here. I asked them a very simple question. What are they doing inside?
You can hear this woman screaming. She just said, "You're here to save me, you're here to save me. I'm trying to get out." Now she's been kept quiet. There are 3 men that answer the door. You can hear her, she's trying to get out. We've definitely found a black jail here.
Liu Zhiyang says her daughter was kidnapped by state agents and taken here, an ad hoc holding facility. This is one way to control ordinary citizens in possession of evidence of government corruption. Liu's daughter had managed to gain access to a phone the night before to tell her mother where she was.
This is a black jail. What in Chinese is called 黑监狱. It's a place for police to capture people without arrest, without charge, and basically disappear them.
In the gloomy halls, Mrs. Liu realizes it's too late. The prisoners had been moved. Black jails are illegal detention centers that allow authorities to bypass the law. In front of cameras, the unidentified men are afraid to take too much action. I ask one of them where they've taken Mrs. Liu's daughter. He tells me she is safe, but he couldn't explain why the detained woman's own family had not been told of her whereabouts.
So as you can see, the situation is that there are black jails despite the new criminal procedure law that's going to be passed at this year's National People's Congress, preventing exactly this type of thing from happening. Family members not informed of the disappearances of their loved ones by police.
Very nice. Melissa, you were not threatened with arrest yourself for being there?
I'm sorry?
You were not threatened with arrest yourself for being there?
They can arrest you, and I've certainly been taken to police stations. You kind of have to just play along and see how things go.
And when they made the decision to expel you, did you know it was coming? You have an expectation?
I knew I was on, for lack of a better word, I knew I was on the shit list. But it hadn't happened in 14 years, so I actually didn't think they'd actually do that.
And do you think because of your Chinese ancestry that you were more targeted?
That's speculation, but it certainly, I'm fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese. And as you can see, I can do real-time translation. That made, I think, for stronger television reporting. And again, I think there were a multiplicity of reasons why they asked me to leave, but the reporting didn't help. And this did take place my last month in China.
But do you think that there was an expectation because of who you were and that you were Chinese American that you would be more tolerant or you would go along with the line?
That's a great question. I remember early on, I was in China for 5 years. Early on, the foreign ministry had a meeting with me where they seemed to intimate that you're ethnically Chinese, you should know better. And in my contact with police, whenever they looked at my US passport, there was always this weird tension. And I got the vibe, I would say, that there was a feeling that I had been traitorous to my motherland. And so I don't know. I don't know how that played into it. I've talked to other Asian American journalists who say that they suspect the same thing. They're held to a higher standard, and it's somehow okay for the bumbling, blonde-haired, blue-eyed BBC correspondent to do human rights stories, but somehow it's not okay when we do it.
Let me turn now to another correspondent who was operated in China. David Barboza of the New York Times, whose articles on the princelings and the wealth of Chinese premier's family and other Chinese officials have just been absolutely stunningly wonderful. David, how about for you? What has been the consequence of this sort of front-page treatment of the people in power in China?
Well, a little different situation, obviously. I'm still in China. I had my visa renewed. Now, the story that I wrote about the relatives of the Prime Minister came out first in October, and the second major piece in November. And of course, I thought about the consequences of this reporting for the entire year that I was reporting, which is most of 2012, actually part of 2011. And so I had to think about, one, whether they would figure out that I'm doing this reporting. And I pretty much felt that once this story is published, I'm through in China, that it's very unlikely that my visa would be renewed, especially knowing what happened to Melissa early in the year, which may have been a sort of a signal to journalists that they weren't going to accept the same kind of reporting. And so I have to say most of 2012, I was conflicted about what to do. As I was developing this story, could I really tell this story? Could I really confirm this story? Would the government figure out what I was doing before I completed the research on this story? I not only thought about the consequences of reporting this on whether I would be allowed to remain in China, but I thought about the consequences if I was wrong about this reporting. In China, it's very difficult to get sources on this kind of thing. We did have lots of documents, but as any journalist should tell you, you always have to fear the consequences if you're wrong. And so I wanted us to really spend the time to research this story out. We had an independent auditor. And so I thought about both what's going to happen to me if I'm right and I try to stay in China, and obviously if there's something that I'm not getting right about this story, what are the consequences of that? So I finished the story and most of it in November, and actually had to leave the country to finish the story because it seemed to me that the government was very much aware, at least by September, October, what I was doing. And we felt there was some threat to me being in China to finish this story. So I finished the story outside of China. And when I left to the airport from Shanghai, I pretty much felt I won't be back. And that was a difficult thing to accept because I've been in China 8 years. My wife is Chinese, and I love reporting from China, and I pretty much felt this is going to be it. I'm going to publish this story, and I won't be back. I did go back at the end of November. I applied for a visa, a journalism visa, which you do at the end of every year, expecting that I would be rejected, and I got one pretty quickly. And so I actually don't know, I can't really tell you why I got a visa. It's pretty complicated. Did they not want to, reject my visa because they thought that would make more news? As you may know, the New York Times email system was hacked. My own email was hacked. My colleague has been denied a visa in Beijing, and he's now in Hong Kong. So there have been consequences. I have been monitored extremely closely by the government. And I can't really tell you why I know that, but I definitely know that. And I knew even before the story was published that they knew what I was doing, they knew how serious it was, and there were pretty serious threats made toward me. So I don't know how to really cleanly say this because there have been consequences. My email was hacked. There's monitoring now. People that have worked with me have had a difficult time, but yet I'm still in China. I have a year-long visa. I hope to stay in China. I hope to report in China. But right now, it'll be a different situation for me as a reporter in China with this much attention on those stories and this much monitoring.
Do you feel safe in China?
I do, but I'm not, it's a little strange. While I was reporting this, I'd asked a lot of people about what did they think would happen to me after this story came out. And most of the people I knew, and these were pretty smart people, They said, one, get out of China. Two, if you stay in China, you won't live very long in China. I mean, they told me lots of different things, and I don't really know how close that was to the truth. But after a while, when you hear that from a lot of smart people, you believe it. So by the end of this year, by the end of last year when I was finishing the story, I believe someone was after me. I believe my life was in danger. I believe my wife's life was in danger. There were different veiled threats. So all of that stuff happens and you become paranoid because this is what's in the air. Once I got back to China, the first 2 weeks, I was pretty darn scared. And then I started to notice some people started to approach me. Some people wanted to actually meet me to talk about this story. Obviously not the sources that would give me this kind of information, but things kind of went back to normal by the end of December. And right now, I know I'm monitored. I know it could be dangerous. I've decided to take the risk, and I feel mostly safe, but I don't really know.
I want to turn now to Daniel Santoro, who's done the same kind of tough reporting, but in his own country. He can't be kicked out of it, but it could be worse. And Daniel, tell us about what happened to you in Argentina.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Please excuse me, I'm reading from a text because my English could be better. I'm working in Clarín newspaper, the largest newspaper in Argentina. First, a little background. As a journalist, I was getting death threats in the days of President Carlos Menem back in the 90s. I uncovered an arms deal between Menem, Ecuador, and Croatia, which led to Menem being thrown in the jail for 6 months. The consequence, Menem started against me a trial for broke state secrets. A trafficant of weapons offered me $50,000 to stop the investigation. But this is the common consequence, the ordinary consequence of all the investigative journalists. But it was nothing like the menace I had been getting from the administration of Cristina Kirchner. I investigate many cases of corruption involving her government. For example, that her son bought $1 million apartment without working a day in his life. And this reports her very angry. In March last year, the pro-government magazine 23 published a report accused me of being a Russian spy. I am married to a Russian woman, but that's all. The magazine put up posters all over the city of Buenos Aires saying I was a Russian spy. At least in the poster I look a lot younger and more handsome. No? I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, as Daniel and David found out, when you start talking about people's money, they get very upset. And that's, of course, what Lowell Bergman likes to do. And he took on some powerful interests way back when, in his probably his second decade of reporting, third decade, and paid the price in court for years. Lowell, take us through it.
In 1975, Jeff Girth and I published an article in Penthouse magazine about what we thought was a well-established group of people in terms of them being identified with organized crime. All of their wealth had been dependent upon loans from the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund for projects that they had built in Las Vegas, both real estate, casinos, and so on. And they had built a large country club golf course complex in northern San Diego County called the La Costa Country Club. I had been a graduate student in the late 1960s in San Diego, and everybody referred to it as the Mafia. That's where the Mafia is. The owners were all Jewish, but the clientele included well-known people, Italian gangsters of all all description, the leadership of the Teamsters, and at that time has now been adjudicated in court that the Central States Pension Fund was controlled by our version of the mafia. So we took all this information together, and it got the glitzy side of the story was that at that time, the lead owner was a man named Merv Adelson, and not Sheldon. I'm dealing with him today. But Merv and the lead organized crime guy was a guy named Mo Dalitz, who has passed away. And so they became also a favorite place for Hollywood personalities, celebrities to come down and party. And they also were, the scene of something called the Frank Fitzsimmons Invitational Golf Tournament that normally had foursomes of various mafia people and loan officers from the fund and so on. So it was not any big secret, but we actually wrote an article which linked Merv's profits, which all came from pension fund investments, that he invested in Hollywood, and his company was the producer of The Waltons, The Blue Knight, Dallas, Knots Landing, and so on. Lorimar Productions, very successful company. That caused them to sue. And they sued. I was driving down Highway 1 on my way to UC Santa Cruz to give a talk, and my then multicolored Volkswagen Beetle. And when the KNX radio, then the all radio AM station came on, and they announced that the owners of La Costa Country Club have sued Lowell Bergman and Jeff Girth for $560 million. And I was swerving off the road. The result was 10 years of litigation. My deposition, 10 years of litigation. They appealed every adverse decision, as high up in the California courts as they could go. And at the same time, they tried everything from accusing us of wiretapping them. They got a number of statements from people in the media, well-known attorneys like Robert Blakey, who's an emeritus professor at Notre Dame, and others all saying that they deserved to have a trial to determine whether or not they really were part of organized crime. In the end, they didn't get anything. They got an exchange of letters 10 years later. Merv wound up marrying Barbara Walters. He became the second largest shareholder in Time Warner, and I went my way, they went their way, but I learned a lot of lessons. I spent a lot of time. I did a 21-day deposition, which is now not legal in California, in 3 separate weeks. And I learned a lot about the law, and I must say the consequences for me made my reporting better, because they made me understand that you were vulnerable if you reported information, even though it had been reported previously, that you have to go back to the original sources, you really have to vet everything you say, everything you read, and so on, when you're going to get entangled with people who have the resources. In this case, they hired a well-known libel lawyer named Louis Nizer, who hung out at the country club, and 3 other law firms. They hired all kinds of private investigators, some of whom are in the room here. Luckily, some of them were friends of mine, so I got, what they didn't count on is that we had a lot of friends, and that's how I survived, who leaked us a lot of stuff along the way. But, so that was, in a sense, put behind me, and it was a learning experience. It definitely had a chilling effect. It had a chilling effect on other people reporting on them. And it wasn't really until the 1980s that the US government really focused on their friends, their source of financing, and what we call traditional organized crime. So why do I bring this all up now? Well, 3 months ago, I get a call from a reporter from Vanity Fair named Brian Burrow, and it turned out that Merv had this fortune. Barbara divorced him. He was very wealthy, but he put a lot of his money into dot-com companies in the late 1990s. And by the early 2000s, he was bankrupt. And I had heard those reports. And so I hadn't heard anything else. And then this reporter calls me and says, well, we were looking him up in order to include this rags, this riches to rags story of a Hollywood mogul. And we found him in Santa Monica living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And the first thing he wanted to talk about, to their surprise, was what he describes now. And see, in the story, we laid out the following, and then I'm going to read you something that was published in In the story, we said that this place was a hangout for organized crime figures, Teamster officials, Frank Fitzsimmons, Jimmy Hoffa, that's the first place they went to look for him when he disappeared. President Nixon was the first place he went to after he resigned the presidency. So it was a lot of, let's say, nefarious people would go there. And that Meyer Lansky himself, the so-called financial genius of organized crime, had been there during the 1960s, up till 1970. They denied all this under oath. They testified this didn't happen, we couldn't prove it, et cetera, et cetera. This is what they published in the magazine. The resort opened in 1965. Now, according to the writer, Adelson dreamed that he could escape this connection that he had to organized crime. At this point, he has admitted to the writer that since 1955, he was a business partner of Mr. Dalitz, and that it was because of that connection to organized crime that he became a multimillionaire. Okay? So he's already admitted that. He says, the first guests were all Teamsters, he exclaims, and then Detroit and Chicago mob bosses, all the way up to Meyer Lansky himself. There were hundreds of them, Adelson adds. I couldn't get rid of them. The Teamsters treated it like their country club. It got a real reputation. I didn't like it at all, but I couldn't stop it. We owed them money. So all I can say is it's one of the consequences of investigative reporting in my case, as I said earlier, that I've lived long enough for this to happen.
So revenge is a soup best taken cold, I take it, right? During that ordeal in court, days after days of tough questioning, did you ever come to say, I wish I had never done this story?
It was probably, I had two advantages. One, there was an insurance policy at the magazine, and so we had lawyers, which is an advantage. The other thing is I didn't have anything. That is, I didn't have any assets, really. So even later, when in another lawsuit where I had $1 million judgment against me, it was kind of a joke, like that's when $1 million was $1 million. Initially, it was very difficult because I couldn't work. And in fact, I remember a hearing, I think it was 1976 or 77, in Los Angeles, and we're sitting in the courtroom, the judge is over there, and on the one side are like 10 lawyers, all from New York, all with their suits, and Mr. Nizer reading something on like computer paper, because he was very elderly at that point, and God knows how much they were paying him per hour, and I'm looking at my watch because I have to get on a plane to fly back to Oakland. I finally said to my attorney, who got up and said, Your Honor, Mr. Bergman has to leave. And the judge said, why? And he said, because he has to apply for public assistance. So it's funny now, but it wasn't so funny then.
During
by the way, though, then I guess the part of it, the other rewarding part of it was that, and this later came out in court testimony, we had mentioned in the article that one of the people who hung around the edges of the country club was a mafia hitman named Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano, very well-known guy, and had been described in government filings, Senate hearings, and all kinds of stuff as the chief executioner for the mafia on the West Coast. Well, Jimmy actually lived down in Hayward in those days. And so they, as he later testified in the early 80s, got him to sue me as a way to scare me. And it was a very wild lawsuit that was eventually thrown out, but it was very difficult to find an attorney who wanted to take his deposition. And the reason we know this story is that Jimmy, while we were going to trial in 1979, Jimmy became a government witness. And he became the poster boy for the U.S. Marshal Service Witness Protection Program and the main witness against the mafia, the original mafia trials that started in 1980, 81, 82, back east. And Jimmy testified to this and as to why he sued. As a favor to his friend Johnny Roselli and the Chicago mob for Mo Dalitz, a love letter. Roselli wound up in he was in Biscayne Bay. Johnny Roselli wound up in Biscayne Bay. Yeah, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but
Jimmy died in witness protection heaven.
Well, let me ask you this question. In the course of that, did you discover flaws in your reporting that troubled you? And that troubled you?
The flaws were, one, don't necessarily take what's already been published as being true, just because it's been published and repeated many times. Because in fact, in the litigation, they would take all that apart all the way back to the beginning. You know, what do you have to back that up? Whereas no one expected them to sue. That was the first part. The second part was I've become much more sophisticated about how I would characterize people's relationships instead of using blanket statements. You know, even if you have all that literature. For instance, we had 25 books with Moe's name in it that said he was, you know, one of the founders of the National Crime Syndicate. He was identified as such in the Kefauver hearings, et cetera, but they kept coming back and saying, but has he ever been convicted of a crime? But my best line, actually, when I was getting tired, they said, well, how can our client be part of organized crime in America if he hasn't been convicted of a crime and he's not Italian? And I said, well, because he's in the Cosa Nostra.
So we've heard from threats from the government, threats from mobsters, and now here to take responsibility for all the ills ever inflicted on reporters is Robert Siegfried, who, in his own description, works to go against poor investigative reporting.
That's true. That's true.
Give us a sense.
I change my description depending on who I'm speaking to,
Yes.
but I actually have the frustrating occupation of disproving negatives, and particularly when media and journalism and investigative journalists get the story wrong, someone like me possibly will show up. I represent parties that actually need advocates in the court of public opinion, not because they're good people or necessarily bad people. They need advocates because public awareness and public opinion is very important to their ability to achieve their objectives. And of course, if that's the case, then since they're operating in forums that are either public or that should be public, they themselves understand, sometimes reluctantly, that they could be subjects of public discourse and therefore various media articles. And that's fair and fair enough, but what isn't fair is when the media gets it wrong. And what my experience has been with a number of the parties in fact all the parties that I've represented, that there has been a breakdown on the investigative journalistic side in terms of just what was being discussed this morning, which was the integrity of these sources and the integrity of the due diligence process that the publication would undergo before printing the article. And obviously the adverse ramifications to my client are significant. They affect the client's reputation, they affect the ability of the client to move forward with their own ability to reach their goals, but they also affect the reputation of the journalist, the editing process that went in place, and the media. There's that famous Mark Twain quote that says, "A lie is halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on." And that, unfortunately, is what people in my business, representing a number of clients, when journalism goes awry, have to experience. And particularly in today's world, where with technology, with competition and pressure to get the product out ahead of someone else, there is a huge inclination, or an increased inclination today as opposed to years ago, to error. And because of technology, that error then spreads like a virus, and you have a number of unfortunate copycat type of articles that appear. And that's the most frustrating thing for someone in my field, because often those copycat articles don't involve reporters who write those articles doing due diligence or checking as to what the facts are. They're just assuming because publication A wrote it, it must be so therefore we're going to reprint it. I wanted to briefly touch upon to show where there can be breakdowns. And I'm sure people are aware of breakdowns where in reporting, but this goes not only for some of the most significant publications or mediums around the world, but also down to some of the ones that perhaps don't have the resources to do the necessary investigative journalism. In the 1980s, and I'll do these very, very briefly, in the 1980s, I worked for a client who was the victim of what was a ultimately well-publicized smear campaign by an international finance company against this particular individual. And
American Express.
American Express, correct. And in that situation, and I particularly emphasize this was in the 1980s, in that situation, what American Express did, or what it had agents do, and agents weren't, which was the more interesting story that was never published, the agents were not someone like myself. The agents of American Express actually took phonied up Interpol reports and other alleged government documents and passed them on to media around the world, and they particularly targeted media that they knew had the least resources to do the due diligence. And the concept was, which worked unfortunately on a fairly large scale, was this would then bubble up and you'd have more and more media, including more established media, picking up that story. It took 5 years to uncover that effort. We actually knew the effort was taking place, but it took 5 years to expose it. Once it was exposed, where American Express publicly admitted that it had engaged in this unusual campaign, although not in a very detailed way, we were still left, my client was still left with the effect of the virus. And this led to our trying to therefore have to use the media to correct the situation that the media had itself created. And we managed eventually, with all the information, to generate what was then, at that time in 1989, the largest story ever published by the Wall Street Journal on this particular situation. If I move forward into the 1990s, but again, in that situation, reporters never checked on the sources, never checked on the integrity of the information. In the 1990s, I was representing a Mexican citizen who became the target of a misinformation campaign by agencies of the U.S. government and by agencies in Mexico. The information that was given to the media was given by U.S. agencies. The basis of much of that information, though, were from two journalists, or alleged journalists. One journalist wrote a report, published a report about Mexico monthly. Turned out that journalist wound up on the payroll of a particular Mexican opposition political party to the political party that my client was associated with. Nobody bothered to check about that journalist or the integrity of that journalist, and yet over a period of 4 to 5 years, that party's information not only was used by agencies and disseminated, but that journalist himself was quoted constantly in publications, again, from the most established to the less established, opining on my client. The second journalist was a journalist who worked for a Mexican publication, but who turned out to also be on the payroll of another opposition party. Again, that journalist's writings served as the basis for much of the information. It got to the point that the Washington Post in around 2019 actually published a report based on a leak to it of a U.S. government agency calling my client a criminal threat to the United States. It's very difficult, obviously, if you're trying to deal with journalism and breakdowns in journalism and then clients' reputations to overcome that type of stuff. The last situation, but again, we're dealing as technology was developing. The last situation I just wanted to briefly mention occurred in the election year 2008. I represented a Canadian entrepreneur who was involved with the former President Clinton, and in early January of 2008, the New York Times published a front-page story about a trip this particular individual took with President Clinton to Kazakhstan. And the point of the article was about that in 2 days after this trip, the Canadian entrepreneur wound up with a lucrative uranium deal. And the implication in the article, or the point of the article, was that there was influence peddling that had occurred. The New York Times actually never called the Canadian entrepreneur before it reported the article. The article itself spawned, over the course of 8 months, over 140 articles around the world. Of those 140, some 90 never bothered to check with the Canadian entrepreneur, me, to the validity of the information. And when I would call up some of these publications to question why they published the article, their answer was, well, it must be true because the New York Times ran it. The point of all of these, the way that was cured by me or by someone like me was we had to find it was not so much taking legal action. That is certainly a nobody wants to undertake litigation, perhaps other than the government, against journalists. It's a no-win situation, particularly depending on the venues. But I had actually approached a reporter early on from Forbes magazine. I had a whole bunch of information and documentation on the transaction that took place and spent a good 2 or 3 months trying to convince that journalist that this was a bona fide transaction that had occurred. That journalist then, believing that, drafted an article some 3 months after the New York Times article, only to be shut down by his editors for a good 4 to 5 other months because the publication's lawyers said to him, how can you be right when everybody else is saying the opposite? And certainly because the New York Times wrote the story this way. And it took 9 months for that particular article to occur. The point of all three of these, and particularly the last one, is it's disturbing to me because of technology, with the rapid nature, the way information moves. It's got a positive, but clearly in the areas that I'm discussing, it's a negative. It creates a public record that is sometimes very difficult to overcome, and it's a record of misinformation that serves no one's interest. It doesn't serve the public's interest. It certainly doesn't serve my client's interest, and it certainly doesn't serve the interests of journalism. So
in your view, what should be the consequences for reporters who you think get it wrong? Should you bankrupt them through lawsuits? Should you ruin their careers or reputations? What do you see as the correct consequences?
Well, I think the answer to that is the bigger responsibility is really the publications and the editors of the publications and the journalistic due diligence that I would assume journalists all have to practice to really put that in practice to try and assure something like that doesn't happen.
But does that reporter become your enemy for life then? You will track him on every story he ever does and point out that he's made a mistake?
It depends on how difficult the reporter is
You might
in trying to rectify the problem that the reporter has caused.
And can you be wrong?
Can I be wrong?
That reporter actually got it right, and you're just on a campaign on behalf of a client who's
Well,
paying you well.
yes, and in fairness to a journalist, obviously somebody like me who speaks to a journalist, they're going to say, okay, this fellow's trying to spin me and this and that and the information. I totally understand that. Again, in the situations I'm describing in the area in which I work, I don't necessarily represent that my clients, as I said, are angels. But what I'm more interested in, why I will take these clients on, is if they can prove to me that what has been written, the subject matter that has been written, is flawed and error-prone, and that the subject matter itself is causing this disruptive occurrence, both in terms of the database and in terms of how the public is perceiving my client and my client's ability to go forward.
Let me just jump around a little bit and get back for a second to Melissa and David. David especially, given what's happened in China, can you go back there and really do the kind of tough reporting that the New York Times expects of you?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I hope so, but I can't be sure. I mean, we'll see what happens. Certainly with the kind of monitoring that goes on in China, and usually, I mean, the problem we have in China is with the people in the Beijing Bureau who are, because they cover politics and human rights and such, are more monitored. I'm a business and economics reporter. I write about culture. So generally, I felt pretty free to travel around. I mean, I did business investigations, but that didn't seem to touch off anything from the government. But certainly, trying to write about the relatives of senior officials is about as bad a thing as you can do in China. And so whether I can really do the kind of reporting that I want to do, whether I can do investigative reporting, I'm not sure.
And Melissa, if you had known you were going to be expelled, would you have done those stories?
Well, I said earlier that I kind of knew I was already in trouble.
So you didn't care?
So, yes, I mean, I'm single, I'm by myself. I don't, some journalists have families to think about. I think that when you have that in the equation, it complicates things. But I had 2 cats, and those cats got out.
Those cats can travel. We got the cats out, so everything's
They were
good.
expelled.
And Lowell, when you were in the middle of that lawsuit, did you do any more reporting on organized crime?
Oh, yeah, lots.
You didn't stop?
Because, well, I took it as an opportunity, since we had subpoena power, to gather a lot more information. And actually, we wound up suing the FBI. In those days, when it started, the FBI really wasn't doing a lot of criminal prosecutions of organized crime. They were doing a lot of intelligence gathering, but not bringing a lot of cases. There were other agencies like the then now defunct IRS Intelligence and some California state agencies, the LAPD. They were all doing a lot more work in that area. And we developed a lot of sources because of that. And with the FBI, we did manage to get there with Freedom of Information and litigation files, which now, when you go to the FBI website and go to their Freedom of Information reading room, Mr. Dalitz's file is the #1 that comes up as an example of the kind of file you might get under organized crime and racketeering. You know, it was very useful that way, and my knowledge got deeper. But I wanted to ask David Barboza, because we had a phone conversation weeks ago, and there was something really interesting to me about what he, when I asked him, I said, well, how well known is it in China that the leadership may be very wealthy and possibly corrupt? And is this a secret, or was this a story hiding in plain sight in many ways?
Well, I think the general public wouldn't really have an idea of how wealthy. I mean, even the people that are in the know, you really doubt whether they know. But I think I said when we talked over the phone that if you're in banking and finance, I mean, the people who were in the financial system in China, and those were the people I was dealing with for all those years. So the first 5 or 6 years, I was doing business and economics reporting, meeting people in finance, private equity, and they would hint to me that the Wen family and other families were incredibly wealthy, and there were rumors that it was in the billions of dollars. But I would say, well, how do you know that? How can we find that out? And they would say, well, you can never find that out. It's through nominees, and it's just everyone knows it. And I was lucky enough eventually to find that you can actually get documents of private corporations in China, and they're filled with amazing information. But I would say only the elites. I actually think people in government, high-ranking government officials, actually know that the families of the top leaders are wealthy. Now, they may not know exactly how wealthy, but they probably have a pretty good idea. It's in the hundreds of millions, that there are several people with billions of dollars. So, but the general public, China, the media is censored. This is not a major topic. If you go to Hong Kong, you can pick up some books that say these things, but there's never real proof. So even myself, I had real doubts about whether I would find that, because it's just, there's a lot of conspiracy theories in China. There's lots of things written in books, and until you can find the documents, you've got to really be skeptical about whether it's true. And so, luckily, we found the documents.
Daniel, let me ask you, you're going to go back to Buenos Aires once this conference is over, or as a Russian spy and FBI lackey? Will you continue that kind of reporting? Are you prepared to go back and face the consequences?
Of course, I continue to report about the corruption in Cristina Kirchner administration, because I think the mission of journalism is to be a watchdog of the democracy. When I discover abroad, one discover this type of corruption, I think we stay near to the truth. So for me, this is very important. I feel passion for the investigative.
And does your newspaper share that passion? Do your editors share it?
My newspaper, Clarín, put a lawyer in me, and was very important, because during 1 year, I don't know what happened in my case. I suppose, you know, in the 2010 here, the FBI discovered a Russian network, Russian spy network, with a very beautiful Russian woman. Do you remember this? Maybe the man. So I suppose, why I suppose? Because I asked to the American embassy, what happened with me? we don't say nothing because the Patriotic Act. So a judge accused me, attorney, no, we don't know nothing. But I suppose the FBI asked for help to the Argentine Intelligence Service. The chief of the Argentine Intelligence Service sued me for $1 million. No, we stay in the so they put my name in this list of the Russian spies. But for me, it's very important to back to Buenos Aires and continue to work in investigative journalism.
Robert, if you were working for the Chinese premier, what would be your advice on stopping David Barboza?
You should pay me a lot of money.
Yeah, right, okay. So, money's no object, we have to stop Barboza, it's really hurting us. What is the way, from the point of view of what you do, to get under the skin of the journalists who are causing problems?
Well, I think actually, I don't try to get under the skin of the journalist. I'm actually trying to get the journalist to do the right thing. So if it's the journalist who's the originator of the story that's flawed, I actually start with that journalist, assuming it's a credible journalist, and try and make an effort to sit down with the journalist and get the story corrected by showing the data that I have to support the position that I'm taking with him, and also to try and make clear to him where the errors are, or her, where the errors are in the story. The problem obviously occurs sometimes the journalists have moved on and they're not interested. For my purposes and my agenda, it's best that if the journalist who's printed or published the wrong story is the journalist who corrects the story. That's the most
That's better
credible.
for you than going to the editor and getting somebody else?
Well, that would be the most credible. The next step is to go to the editor. But if that doesn't work, as I said, and you asked the question earlier, the legal courts really, particularly in the United States, are I don't feel, are not an option. Then it's a question, can you find other media who will do the right story to at least neutralize or try to neutralize the adverse story, as well as stop the spread of the misinformation?
There are a couple of journalists who have some questions for you. Let's see.
Ronnie Boyd, Southern Investigative Reporting Foundation, for the gentleman who text. What's your standard for being convinced of the claims of a potential client? And then could you go into clients you've rejected because they couldn't convince you?
All right. Well, different standards. If the client that comes to me has a history prior to meeting with me of really being having an adverse record, I mean a proven adverse record, that's almost a no-brainer for me, and I won't take the client on. But typically, as I said, it's not that I make a judgment on whether the client's an angel or not. What I'm really focused on is the subject matter that the client has at issue. And then I require the client to satisfy me particularly through documentation and parties who would be knowledgeable about the validity of the documentation to assure me, convince me that the documentation is appropriate. That's really the standard that I've used. Rejecting clients, going back to the first situation that I mentioned, which was the American Express situation, after that, it was interesting, a lot of parties who either felt they had been defamed or wanted to defame would call me up on the phone, and I wouldn't actually operate for anybody who wanted to defame. That was of no interest to me. Those who felt defamed was really the standards that I just suggested.
David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to say that, I actually think his role is an important role, and my job is to get to him before I write the story. Right. And David Barstow and I were talking the other night in New York about how we approached investigative stories when we're dealing with some situation where we want to make sure that who we're writing about, that they get a very good opportunity to respond. And so in the case of my story, and I'm sure in David's story, you make the greatest effort possible to get to that individual, to that company, and to show them as much as possible. And so for the stories that I did on the relatives of the Prime Minister, I went detail by detail over every fact in that story with representatives of that family. And of course, that was really important for me to feel comfortable and for the editors to feel comfortable, and to do things like hiring an outside auditor and to make sure we find someone like him who can say, go ahead, challenge this. We will fight it out. We want to fight it out before the story's published.
Good point. Next question. Got time.
Yeah,
Yes.
question for Bruce Kuhn with KQED for Ms. Chan. What did Al Jazeera do in support of that, and do they have someone in China now in your situation?
There's no correspondent, and there has not been a correspondent in Beijing for Al Jazeera English since I left. Briefly, Al Jazeera English was given a short-term visa to cover the 18th Party Congress, the leadership handover in October.
Stan Gould.
I wonder if any of the
Wait, what's that? Is there a follow-up here?
Sorry, did I? What did they do? Did they protest? Did they have any?
Why don't you wait for
When I left, the channel issued a press release and essentially announced that I had been expelled. That was a decision on the channel's part to use that word. It is burning a bit of a bridge with the Chinese. It's a slap in the face. They care very much about face. So every news organization has to decide how they want to frame the departure, and that was the decision that my channel took. And it did get a little bit of, I was bizarrely in the media cycle for 15 seconds of fame.
Stan.
Do any of the New York Times guys know if their internet edition, if they compete with the Washington Post in getting stuff on their internet edition?
In China?
No, in this country or anywhere. I mean, on the
What?
worldwide, they publish it. I open up my computer, it's
Right,
at my
right.
desktop.
Right.
Do they feel competitive? Do you know if the Post and the Times and the other good papers, whether they compete on their internet edition?
Absolutely.
Is there competition in
Absolutely.
journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's
That's where the technology starts to take over.
right. I mean,
One source.
let me tell you, I've got to file 17 times a day now. We're competing constantly online, so it's a totally different game today. Yeah.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Drew Sullivan from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project in Sarajevo. Currently, we're facing 4 lawsuits from one of the persons we wrote in 4 different countries. And increasingly, you see a lot of scorched earth lawsuits where they fight everything all the way up through the system. It's coming from organized crime or coming from large businesses. And yet, more investigative reporting is being done at universities and at small NGOs that are doing the investigative reporting. Are we in for a problem coming up? Is this going to be a serious problem?
A fair use problem?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean. I mean, depends on what country you're in and what the laws are in terms of
No, but even in the United States, I mean, you now have liability in 196 countries when you publish on the internet.
I don't know. I have to talk to my pro bono lawyers.
You can be sued in lots of
Around the
places.
room.
Yeah. U.S., England, they like to sue.
Right, and pro bono can
No,
only...
I recently had a situation with a British-based news organization where they were very interested in a story that we're working on, but it's clear that some of the people involved are very litigious, and they decided that they would rather not. Not based on the quality of the story, but just because they realized it was going to cost a lot of money, probably, whether it was a accurate story or not. But that's based on British law, I believe, that those decisions were made.
Well, once again this year, it's clear there are great consequences to great reporting, and we're going to come back in a half hour for the next panel. But right now, thanks to these very fine folks.